The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight when Ranger Powell heard the noise coming from his barn, a sound that didn't belong to any of his horses or cattle. And when he pushed open the heavy wooden door with his rifle raised, the last thing he expected to find was a woman huddled in the corner beneath a pile of hay, her lips blue from cold and her eyes wide with terror. It was January of 1884 in Montrose, Colorado, and the winter had proven to be one of the harshest anyone could remember. Ranger had been working his ranch alone for the past 2 years, ever since his father died and left him the property. At 26 years old, he had grown accustomed to the solitude, the endless work, and the unforgiving landscape that stretched out in every direction. But nothing had prepared him for finding a half-frozen stranger in his barn. The woman scrambled backward when she saw him, her hands raised defensively. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark auburn hair that hung in tangled waves around her face. Her dress was torn and dirty, completely inadequate for the weather outside. She was trembling so violently that Ranger could see it even from several feet away. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the howling wind outside. "Please don't hurt me." Ranger lowered his rifle immediately, setting it against the barn wall. He held up both hands to show he meant no harm. "Madam, I'm not going to hurt you, but you're going to freeze to death out here. How long have you been in my barn?" She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shaking. "Since yesterday morning. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for trespassing." "I didn't know where else to go." The genuine fear in her eyes made Ranger's chest tighten. Whatever had brought this woman to hide in his barn in the middle of a blizzard, she was clearly running from something terrible. He took a step closer, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "You're forgiven," he said softly. "But right now, we need to get you inside before you lose any fingers or toes to frostbite. Can you walk?" She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. Ranger moved quickly, catching her before she could fall face first into the straw. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, and he could feel how cold her skin was even through her thin dress. He grabbed a horse blanket with one hand and wrapped it around her, before carrying her out of the barn and across the yard to his house. The wind whipped snow into their faces, and Ranger had to lean forward to make any progress. The woman buried her face against his chest, her whole body curled inward seeking warmth. By the time he kicked open his front door and got them both inside, his arms were aching and his face was numb from the cold. He set her down gently in the chair closest to the fireplace, which still had glowing embers from the fire he had built that morning. He quickly added more wood and stoked the flames until they roared back to life. Then he turned his attention to his unexpected guest. She was staring at the fire with an expression of such profound relief that it made Ranger wonder just how close she had come to death. Her lips were still blue, and her hands shook as she held them toward the warmth. "I need to check your extremities," Ranger said, kneeling in front of her. "Frostbite can set in fast in weather like this." She nodded mutely, too cold to speak. Ranger carefully removed her worn boots, which were soaked through and offered almost no protection. Her stockings were full of holes, and her toes were an alarming shade of white. He grabbed towels and began to gently warm her feet, watching for any signs of serious damage. After a few minutes of careful attention, color began to return to her toes, and he breathed a sigh of relief. "I think you'll be all right," he said, "but you need to get out of these wet clothes and into something warm and dry." The woman looked up at him with exhaustion in her eyes. "I don't have anything else." Ranger stood and went to his bedroom, returning with one of his thick flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks. "These will be too big, but they're warm and dry. There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. I'll make you something hot to drink." He turned his back to give her privacy and busied himself in the kitchen, heating water and preparing coffee. He could hear the rustle of fabric as she changed, and he kept his eyes firmly on the stove. When she finally emerged from behind the screen, she was swimming in his shirt, which fell to her knees like a dress. Her wet clothes were draped over the screen to dry. "Thank you," she said quietly, returning to the chair by the fire. "You didn't have to help me." Ranger brought her a cup of hot coffee and pulled up another chair to sit across from her. "What's your name?" She hesitated, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. Grace Fairweather." "I'm Ranger Powell. This is my ranch." He studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way she kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "You want to tell me why you were hiding in my barn, Grace Fairweather?" Grace took a long sip of coffee, and Ranger could see her weighing how much to tell him. Finally, she set the cup down and met his eyes. "I was running away from my stepfather. He's been trying to force me to marry a man named Walter Gaines. Walter is 53 years old and already buried 2 wives. Everyone in town knows he beat them, but he has money and influence, so nobody says anything." Ranger felt anger rising in his chest. "And your stepfather was willing to hand you over to a man like that?" "My mother died 6 months ago," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "My stepfather, Henry Foster, only married her for her small inheritance. Once she was gone, he saw me as a way to make more money. Walter offered him $500 for my hand in marriage. When I refused, Henry locked me in my room and said the wedding would happen whether I agreed or not." "So you ran," Ranger said. "I climbed out my window 3 nights ago," Grace continued. "I took what little money I had hidden away and caught a stage heading west. I thought I could make it to Denver and find work there, maybe as a seamstress or a cook. But the stage broke an axle about 10 miles east of here, and while they were trying to fix it, I saw Henry ride up with 2 men. I don't know how he tracked me down so fast, but I knew if he caught me, I'd never get another chance to escape. So I ran into the woods and kept running until I couldn't anymore. And you ended up at my barn," Ranger finished. Grace nodded. "I saw your ranch from the ridge yesterday morning. The blizzard was getting worse, and I knew I wouldn't survive another night in the open. I'm truly sorry for trespassing. I know you could have me arrested, but please, I'm begging you, don't send me back to Henry. I'll work for you, do whatever you need, just please don't make me go back." The desperation in her voice cut through Ranger like a knife. He had always prided himself on being a fair man, someone who followed the law and did right by his neighbors. But the law wasn't always just, and in this case, it seemed to be working against an innocent young woman who was only trying to save herself from a life of misery. "You're not going anywhere in this storm," Ranger said firmly. "And I'm not in the habit of sending women back to men who would hurt them. You can stay here until the weather clears and we figure out what to do next." Relief flooded Grace's face, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Ranger stood and moved toward the kitchen. "You need to eat something. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" "I don't remember," Grace admitted. 2 days, maybe 3, Ranger set about preparing food, slicing bread and cheese, and heating up a pot of stew that he had made the day before. Grace watched him with curious eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe that this stranger was being kind to her without expecting anything in return. As they ate together in comfortable silence, Ranger found himself studying her more closely. She was beautiful. There was no denying that, with delicate features and expressive hazel eyes that seemed to shift between green and gold in the firelight. But it was more than her appearance that drew him. There was a strength in her, a determination that had carried her through 3 days of running and hiding in a blizzard. She hadn't given up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. "Tell me about yourself," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Do you run this ranch all alone?" Ranger nodded. "My father built this place from nothing. He died 2 years ago, left it all to me. It's just me and the animals now. I've got about 30 head of cattle and 4 horses. It's not a big operation, but it's honest work." "It must be lonely," Grace observed. "Sometimes," Ranger admitted. "But I'm used to it, and the work keeps me busy enough that I don't have much time to think about it." They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing more easily than Ranger would have expected. Grace told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother's kindness and her love of reading and music. Ranger shared stories about his father, about learning to rope and ride, about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. When Grace finally began to nod off in her chair, Ranger showed her to his bedroom. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Grace protested, but Ranger wouldn't hear any arguments. He brought her extra blankets and made sure she had everything she needed before closing the door and returning to the main room. He made himself a bed on the floor near the fireplace, but sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept returning to Grace's story, to the fear in her eyes when she talked about Walter Gaines and her stepfather. Ranger knew men like that existed, had seen firsthand how they used their power and money to get whatever they wanted. It made his blood boil. The next morning, Ranger woke to the smell of coffee brewing. He sat up quickly, momentarily disoriented, and saw Grace standing at the stove. She had somehow managed to make his oversized shirt look almost presentable, tying it at the waist with a piece of rope she must have found. Her hair was pulled back from her face, and though she still looked exhausted, there was more color in her cheeks. "Good morning," she said with a shy smile. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to make myself useful." Ranger stood and stretched, his back aching from sleeping on the floor. "You didn't have to do that, but I appreciate it." "It's the least I can do," Grace said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "You saved my life yesterday." They ate breakfast together, and then Ranger bundled up to go check on the animals. The blizzard had finally stopped, leaving behind nearly 3 feet of fresh snow. It took him twice as long as usual to complete his morning chores, but he was grateful that all the animals had survived the storm without incident. When he returned to the house, he found Grace sitting at the table with a needle and thread she had found in his mother's old sewing basket. She was carefully mending a tear in her dress, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "You're good at that," Ranger observed, stomping the snow off his boots. "My mother taught me," Grace said. "She was an excellent seamstress. I always thought I might open my own shop someday, but that dream seems pretty far away now." Ranger hung up his coat and sat down across from her. "Grace, we need to talk about what happens next. Your stepfather is looking for you. If he tracked you to the stage, he might eventually make his way here." Grace's hands stilled on her sewing. "I know. I've been thinking about it all morning. Maybe when the snow melts enough, I could head further west. There are mining towns in the mountains where I could disappear." "Those mining towns are rough places," Ranger said. "A woman alone would face all sorts of dangers, more dangerous than being forced to marry Walter Gaines." Grace asked quietly. Ranger couldn't argue with that logic. "There might be another option. You could stay here." Grace looked up sharply. "What? Just hear me out," Ranger said, leaning forward. "If anyone comes asking, you're my hired help. It's not uncommon for ranches to take on extra hands, and with my father gone, it would make sense that I might need assistance. You can earn your keep by helping with the cooking and mending, maybe tending the kitchen garden when spring comes. It would give you a safe place to stay while we figure out a more permanent solution." "Why would you do that for me?" Grace asked, her eyes searching his face. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Ranger said. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you'd rather risk death in a blizzard than marry a man who would hurt you. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Grace set down her sewing, and Ranger could see the emotion welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," Ranger said simply. Grace nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'll stay, and I promise I'll earn my keep. You won't regret this." The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Ranger would wake early to tend to the animals while Grace prepared breakfast. They would eat together, talking about their plans for the day. And then Ranger would head out to work on various projects around the ranch while Grace tackled the household chores. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Grace would read aloud from the few books Ranger owned, her voice bringing the stories to life in a way that captivated him. As the weeks passed, Ranger found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening, knowing Grace would be there with a warm meal and a welcoming smile. She brought a lightness to his home that he hadn't realized was missing. The house felt less empty, less like a place where he simply existed and more like an actual home. Grace seemed to be healing too, both physically and emotionally. The fear that had haunted her eyes gradually faded, replaced by a growing sense of security. She laughed more easily, smiled more often, and began to share more stories about her life before everything fell apart. One evening in late February, as they sat together working on their respective tasks, Grace suddenly spoke up. "Ranger, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, looking up from the harness he was repairing. "Why aren't you married? A man like you, with your own land and a good character, surely there must have been women interested." Ranger set down the harness and considered the question. "I suppose I never found the right person. After my father died, I was so focused on keeping the ranch running that I didn't have much time for courting. And most of the women in town are looking for someone more established, someone with a bigger spread and more money in the bank." "Then they're fools," Grace said firmly. "Anyone can see you're a good man." The conviction in her voice made Ranger's heart skip a beat. He had grown fond of Grace over the past weeks, more fond than he probably should have. But he had been careful not to show it, not wanting her to feel obligated or uncomfortable. She had come to him seeking safety, not romance, and he would respect that. "That's kind of you to say," Ranger replied, picking up the harness again to hide his expression. March arrived with warmer temperatures and the slow retreat of winter. The snow began to melt, turning the roads into muddy rivers. Ranger knew that it was only a matter of time before travelers would start passing through the area again, which meant the risk of Grace being discovered increased. His concerns proved justified when, on a cloudy afternoon in mid-March, a rider approached the ranch. Ranger was in the barn when he heard the horse, and he immediately went on alert. He walked out to meet the visitor, positioning himself so that he blocked the view of the house. The man who dismounted was wearing a marshal's badge. He was older, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face. "Afternoon," the marshal said. "Name's Tom Crawford. I'm looking for a young woman, goes by Grace Fairweather. Her stepfather reported her missing back in January. Last anyone saw, she was on a stage that broke down about 10 miles east of here. You wouldn't happen to have seen her, would you?" Ranger kept his expression neutral. "What's this stepfather's name?" "Henry Foster. He's offering a reward for information leading to her return. Says she ran away and he's worried sick about her." "I bet he is," Ranger said dryly. "Did he mention why she ran away?" Marshal Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Said it was a misunderstanding about a marriage arrangement, but that's family business, none of my concern." I'm just trying to make sure the girl is safe. If I had found a young woman half frozen in a blizzard, I would have made sure she was safe," Ranger said carefully. "And if that young woman told me she was running from a forced marriage to an older man with a reputation for beating his wives, I would have told her she could stay as long as she needed." The marshal studied Ranger's face for a long moment. "That's a mighty specific hypothetical." "Just speaking generally," Ranger replied. "But if such a situation were to exist, I'd say the law ought to be more concerned with protecting that young woman than returning her to people who would harm her." Marshal Crawford sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, son, I hear what you're saying. And between you and me, I know Walter Gaines. I know what kind of man he is. But the law is the law, and unless the young woman in question is married or has reached her majority, her stepfather has legal authority over her." "She's 22 years old," Ranger said. "Well past her majority." The marshal raised an eyebrow. "Is she now? Well, that changes things considerably. A woman of 22 is free to make her own decisions about where she lives and who she marries." "That's what I thought," Ranger said. Marshal Crawford nodded slowly. "I'll be sure to include that information in my report to Mr. Foster. I'll tell him I searched the area thoroughly and found no sign of his stepdaughter. And I'll remind him that even if she were found, she's an adult woman who can't be compelled to return somewhere she doesn't want to be." "I appreciate your understanding, Marshal. Just make sure that if this hypothetical young woman exists, she stays out of sight for a while," the marshal advised. "Henry Foster strikes me as the stubborn type, and he might not take no for an answer, legal or not." After the marshal rode away, Ranger returned to the house to find Grace standing by the window, her face pale. "I heard everything," she said. "Do you think he'll really protect me?" "I think he's a decent man doing his best in a complicated situation," Ranger said. "But he's right that we need to be careful. Your stepfather might decide to take matters into his own hands." Grace wrapped her arms around herself. "Maybe I should leave. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "You're not going anywhere," Ranger said firmly. He crossed the room and gently took her shoulders, making her look at him. "Grace, I meant what I said when I offered you a place here. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you or force you into something you don't want." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you being so good to me?" The question hung in the air between them, and Ranger knew this was the moment of truth. He could continue to pretend that his feelings were purely protective, that he saw her only as someone who needed help. Or he could be honest, even if it risked changing everything between them. "Because I care about you," Ranger said quietly. "More than I probably should given the circumstances. But over these past weeks, you've become important to me. This house feels like a home again when you're in it. And I find myself looking for excuses to come back early from working, just so I can spend more time talking with you." Grace stared at him, her lips parted in surprise. "Ranger, you don't have to say anything," Ranger interrupted, releasing her shoulders and stepping back. "I know you came here looking for safety, not romance. I'm not expecting anything from you. I just wanted you to know why I'm willing to stand between you and anyone who would try to take you away." "What if I wanted to say something?" Grace asked softly. "What if I told you that I've been feeling the same way? That I look forward to hearing your voice in the morning and that I feel safest when you're near?" Ranger's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Grace could hear it. "Do you mean that?" "Every word," Grace said, taking a step closer to him. "I know the timing is complicated. I know I'm still technically a fugitive from my stepfather. But what I feel for you is real, Ranger. You've shown me what kindness and respect look like. You've treated me like a person with my own thoughts and desires, not property to be traded or sold. How could I not fall in love with you?" The last words came out in a rush, as if Grace couldn't quite believe she was saying them. Ranger reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had spilled onto her cheeks. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Would it be all right if I kissed you?" she answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened as weeks of suppressed longing burst free. Ranger wrapped his arms around Grace's waist and pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. "I think I have since the moment I found you in my barn." "I love you too," Grace replied, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." They stood there holding each other as the afternoon light faded into evening, both of them aware that they were standing on the threshold of something beautiful and terrifying. They were in love, but the threat of Henry Foster still loomed over them. They would have to find a way to build a future together despite the obstacles in their path. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Ranger brought up the practical considerations they needed to address. "We need to make your position here more secure," he said. The marshal was sympathetic, but if your stepfather shows up with legal papers or causes enough of a fuss, it could still create problems. "What do you suggest?" Grace asked. Ranger took a deep breath. Knowing what he was about to propose was sudden, even reckless. But it also felt absolutely right. "Marry me." Grace's eyes widened. "What?" "I know we've only known each other for a couple of months," Ranger said quickly. "And I know this isn't the most romantic proposal, but if you're my wife, your stepfather has no legal claim to you whatsoever. You would be under my protection, and no one could force you to do anything against your will." "Is that the only reason you're asking?" Grace asked quietly. "No," Ranger said firmly. "I'm asking because I love you and I want to spend my life with you. The legal protection is just an added benefit." "But I understand if this is too fast, if you need more time." "Yes," Grace interrupted. "Yes, you need more time, or yes, I'll marry you," Grace said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Ranger Powell, I will absolutely marry you." Ranger pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the love and hope he felt in his heart. When they finally separated, he was grinning like a fool. "We should do it soon," he said, "before your stepfather has a chance to cause more trouble." "Tomorrow," Grace suggested. "Tomorrow," Ranger agreed. The next morning they rode into Montrose together, Grace wearing her mended dress and Ranger in his Sunday best. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with shops and businesses. They headed straight for the church, where they found Reverend Matthews preparing for the Sunday service. The Reverend was a kind man in his early 60s who had known Ranger since he was a boy. He listened to their request with a mixture of surprise and approval. "I must say, Ranger, I never expected you to show up asking to be married on a Thursday morning," he said with a chuckle. "But if this is what you both want, I'm happy to perform the ceremony. Do you have witnesses?" "We were hoping you might help us find some," Ranger admitted. Reverend Matthews nodded. "My wife can serve as one witness, and I'm sure we can find someone else willing to help. Give me a few minutes to make arrangements." Within the hour, they were standing before the Reverend with his wife Martha and the local schoolteacher Miss Helen Cooper, serving as witnesses. Ranger held Grace's hands and looked into her eyes as he repeated his vows, promising to love and cherish her for all the days of his life. Grace's voice was strong and clear as she made the same promises to him. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Ranger kissed Grace with a joy that seemed to radiate from the very core of his being. They were married. Grace was his wife, and no one could take her away from him now. After signing the marriage certificate and thanking the reverend and their witnesses, Ranger and Grace made one more stop in town. They visited the office of the local newspaper and placed an announcement of their marriage, making sure it would be printed in the next edition. The more public record they had of the marriage, the harder it would be for anyone to challenge its legitimacy. As they rode back to the ranch, Grace kept looking at the simple gold band Ranger had purchased from the general store. It wasn't fancy, but it represented everything she had hoped for and more. "Mrs. Grace Powell," she said, testing the name. "I like how that sounds." "So do I," Ranger said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. That evening they celebrated their wedding with a simple dinner at home. Ranger had never been much of a cook, but he did his best to make something special. Grace laughed at his earnest attempts and eventually took over, the two of them working together in the kitchen like they had been doing it for years. After dinner, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Grace leaned her head on Ranger's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For giving me a chance at happiness," Grace replied. "A few months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I would be trapped forever in a nightmare with no way out. But you changed everything. You gave me hope and safety and love. You gave me a future." Ranger wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "You gave me those things too. I didn't realize how lonely I was until you were here. You brought light and warmth into my life, Grace. You made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Both of them knew that challenges still lay ahead, that Henry Foster might not give up easily, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The peaceful days that followed their wedding felt like a gift. Spring was arriving in earnest, bringing warmer temperatures and new growth. Grace worked in the garden, planting vegetables and herbs, while Ranger tended to the cattle and horses. They fell into an easy partnership, each complementing the other's strengths and covering for their weaknesses. In the evenings, they would sit together and make plans for the future. Ranger talked about expanding the herd and maybe buying more land if they had a good year. Grace spoke about her dream of raising chickens and perhaps getting a milk cow. They discussed everything from practical matters to their hopes and dreams, building a vision of the life they wanted to create together. Their love continued to deepen as they learned more about each other. Ranger discovered that Grace had a beautiful singing voice and would often hum while she worked. Grace learned that Ranger was surprisingly well-read despite his rough exterior, and loved discussing books and ideas. They found that they could talk for hours without running out of things to say, and they were equally comfortable in companionable silence. It was in mid-April when their fragile peace was shattered. Ranger was working on fixing a section of fence when he saw 3 riders approaching from the east. Something about the way they moved, purposeful and aggressive, set off warning bells in his mind. He quickly headed back to the house, arriving just as the riders pulled up in front. The man in the lead was in his late 40s with cold eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. Ranger didn't need an introduction to know this was Henry Foster. The 2 men with him looked like hired guns, the kind of men who would do anything for the right price. Grace had seen them coming and was standing in the doorway, her face pale but her expression defiant. Ranger positioned himself between her and the riders. "This is private property," Ranger said firmly. "State your business or leave." "My business is with her," Henry said, pointing at Grace. "That's my stepdaughter and she ran away from home. I'm here to bring her back where she belongs." "Grace is my wife," Ranger said coldly. "She's exactly where she belongs." Henry's face twisted with anger. "Wife? That's impossible. She's not old enough to marry without my consent." She's 22 years old, Ranger replied, well past the age of majority. We were married by Reverend Matthews in Montrose, with proper witnesses and a signed certificate. It's all legal and binding. It's a lie, Henry snarled. You probably forced her or tricked her into it. He did nothing of the sort, Grace said, stepping out from behind Ranger despite his attempt to keep her back. I married him of my own free will because I love him. Something you would never understand, Henry. You only see people as commodities to be bought and sold. You ungrateful girl, Henry spat. After everything I did for you and your mother, you did nothing for us, Grace interrupted, her voice shaking with anger. You married my mother for her money and treated her like a servant until the day she died. And then you tried to sell me to Walter Gaines like I was livestock. Well, I'm not your property anymore. I'm a married woman, and you have no legal authority over me. One of the hired guns started to dismount, but Ranger pulled his rifle from where he had propped it against the porch railing. I wouldn't do that if I were you. This is my land, and you're trespassing. If any of you so much as step foot on my property without permission, I'm within my rights to defend it. The man looked at Henry, who was practically vibrating with rage. For a moment, Ranger thought Foster might order his men to attack anyway, consequences be damned. But then the sound of approaching horses made everyone turn. Marshal Crawford was riding up the road with two other men, both wearing deputy badges. He took in the scene with a knowing look and positioned his horse between Henry's group and the porch. "Afternoon, folks," the marshal said mildly. "Mr. Foster, I thought I made it clear when you came to my office that Miss Fairweather, being of legal age, couldn't be compelled to return to your custody." "She's been deceived," Henry argued. "This man took advantage of her vulnerable state. Actually, I came by last week to check on the newlyweds," Marshal Crawford lied smoothly. "I spoke with Mrs. Powell privately, and she assured me that she entered into the marriage freely and happily, even showed me the certificate. Everything was in order." Ranger felt a surge of gratitude toward the marshal, who was clearly stretching the truth to protect Grace. "Furthermore," the marshal continued, "I've received some interesting information from Missouri. Seems there are questions about how you managed your late wife's estate, Mr. Foster. The county court back there has asked me to inform you that your presence is requested for a hearing about potential financial improprieties." Henry's face went white. "That's ridiculous. I managed everything properly." "Then I'm sure you'll have no trouble explaining that to the court," Marshal Crawford said. "But I'd suggest you head back to Missouri sooner rather than later and leave the Powells alone. If I hear about you or your associates bothering them again, I'll have to assume you're involved in harassment, which could lead to additional charges." Henry looked like he wanted to argue further, but the presence of the marshal and his deputies made it clear he was outmatched. With a final hateful glare at Grace, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his hired guns following. After they disappeared over the ridge, Marshal Crawford dismounted and approached the porch. "Sorry about that. I saw them riding through town asking questions about you, and I figured I'd better follow to make sure things didn't get out of hand." "We can't thank you enough, Marshal," Ranger said, shaking his hand firmly. "Just doing my job," Crawford replied. "But between you and me, I meant what I said about those financial irregularities. I sent a telegram to the county court in Missouri making some inquiries, and it turns out several people have raised concerns about Foster's handling of his late wife's money. He'll be too busy dealing with that to bother you for a good long while." "Is that true, or did you make it up to scare him?" Grace asked. The marshal gave her a slight smile. "Does it matter? One way or another, you're free of him now, Mrs. Powell." After the marshal and his deputies left, Ranger and Grace stood on the porch holding each other. Grace was trembling, the confrontation having taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. "It's over," Ranger said softly, stroking her hair. "He can't hurt you anymore." "I can't believe he actually came here," Grace said. "I knew he was stubborn, but I didn't think he'd go this far." "He probably thought he could intimidate us," Ranger said, "but he underestimated you. The way you stood up to him, Grace. I was so proud of you." Grace pulled back to look at him. "I wasn't going to let him take me away from you. Not without a fight." "You'll never have to worry about that," Ranger promised. "You're my wife, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're safe and happy." That night, as they lay together in bed, Grace was quieter than usual. Ranger could tell she was processing everything that had happened. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pulling her closer. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," Grace said. "A few months ago, I was at the lowest point of my life, cold and scared and certain I was going to die. And now I'm here, married to a wonderful man, safe and warm and loved. It almost doesn't seem real." "It's real," Ranger assured her, "and it's only going to get better from here." As spring turned into summer, those words proved prophetic. The ranch flourished under their combined care. The cattle were healthy and multiplying, the garden produced an abundant harvest, and they even added chickens just as Grace had hoped. Their home was filled with laughter and love, and they became known in Montrose as a devoted couple who worked hard and treated everyone fairly. Grace made friends with several of the women in town, including Helen Cooper, the schoolteacher who had served as a witness at their wedding. Ranger renewed old friendships and made new ones, proud to introduce Grace as his wife. They attended church on Sundays and community gatherings, slowly becoming woven into the fabric of the town. In August, Grace realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before telling Ranger. When she finally shared the news with him one evening after dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down gently, worried he might have hurt her. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Grace, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" Grace asked, though his expression left no doubt. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Ranger said, kneeling down and placing his hand gently on her stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I can't wait to meet you." Grace laughed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We should start thinking about names." "We have time," Ranger said, standing and pulling her into his arms. "Right now, I just want to hold my beautiful wife and think about how blessed I am." The months of Grace's pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Ranger built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands creating each piece with love and care. They transformed the small room next to their bedroom into a nursery, painting it a cheerful yellow and filling it with everything a baby might need. In late March of 1885, just over a year after Ranger had found Grace in his barn, she went into labor. Ranger rode to town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Jennings who had delivered most of the babies in Montrose for the past 20 years. He also brought back Helen Cooper and Martha Matthews, who stayed to support Grace through the long hours of labor. Ranger paced the main room, jumping every time he heard a sound from the bedroom. The women had insisted he stay out of the way, and though he hated feeling useless, he respected their expertise. As night fell and the labor continued, his worry grew. Finally, just after midnight, he heard the cry of a baby. Moments later, Mrs. Jennings emerged with a smile on her face. "Congratulations, Mr. Powell. You have a healthy baby boy." Ranger rushed into the bedroom to find Grace propped up against pillows, exhausted but glowing with happiness. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. Ranger approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. His eyes were closed, his small fist curled against his cheek. Ranger felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. "He's perfect," Ranger whispered. "Grace, you did such an amazing job." "Do you want to hold him?" Grace asked. With careful guidance from Mrs. Jennings, Ranger took his son into his arms. The baby was so small and light, yet felt like the most precious thing in the world. As he cradled his son, Ranger made a silent promise to always protect and love this child, to give him the kind of life full of opportunity and security. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. They had discussed several options over the months, but suddenly Ranger knew exactly what felt right. "What do you think of Robert? We could call him Bobby." Grace smiled. "Robert Powell, I love it." Little Bobby proved to be a relatively easy baby, sleeping well and feeding without much fuss. Grace took to motherhood naturally, her gentle nature perfectly suited to caring for an infant. Ranger was a devoted father, taking every opportunity to hold and play with his son. Watching Grace with Bobby, seeing the love in her eyes as she nursed him or sang him lullabies, Ranger fell even more deeply in love with his wife. As Bobby grew from infant to toddler, the Powell family continued to prosper. Ranger expanded the ranch, buying additional land from a neighbor who was retiring. Grace's garden grew larger each year, and she began selling her excess produce in town. They worked hard but always made time for each other and for Bobby, understanding that family came before everything else. When Bobby was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, who had her mother's auburn hair and hazel eyes. Bobby was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. The house was filled with the sounds of children playing and laughing, the patter of small feet, and the joy that comes from a loving family. More children followed over the years. 2 years after Rose came another boy they named James, and then 3 years later, twin girls they named Lucy and Lily. The Powell household was chaos at times, but it was the kind of chaos that comes from abundance rather than dysfunction. Grace and Ranger worked together to raise their children with love, discipline, and values that would serve them well in life. As the years passed, Grace often reflected on how far she had come from that terrified girl hiding in a barn. She had built a life beyond her wildest dreams, surrounded by people she loved and who loved her in return. She watched her children grow up strong and healthy, secure in the knowledge that they would never face the kind of uncertainty and fear she had experienced. Ranger, too, marveled at the journey his life had taken. He had gone from a lonely widower running a ranch alone to a husband and father with a full, rich life. Every day, he thanked whatever force had brought Grace to his barn that snowy January night. She had transformed his existence in ways he was still discovering. They made sure to pass on their love story to their children, wanting them to understand the importance of kindness, courage, and standing up for what's right. Bobby especially loved hearing about how his mother had run away in a blizzard, and how his father had chosen to help a stranger rather than turn her away. "And that's why you always help people in need," Ranger would conclude the story. "Because you never know when that person might become the most important thing in your life." Over the years, they heard occasional news about Henry Foster and Walter Gaines. Henry had indeed been investigated for financial improprieties and had lost most of his wealth in legal fees and settlements. He died a bitter, lonely man when Grace was 29, and she felt nothing but relief at the news. Walter Gaines had eventually married again, but his fourth wife left him after only 6 months, and he became a cautionary tale in the county about the perils of cruelty and abuse. Marshall Crawford remained a friend of the family until his retirement, often stopping by the ranch to check on them and play with the children. He never took credit for the role he played in protecting Grace, but both she and Ranger made sure he knew how grateful they were. As their children grew older, the Powell Ranch became known as one of the most successful in the area. Ranger and Grace's reputation for honesty and hard work meant they were respected throughout the county. They helped their neighbors when times were tough and celebrated with them when things went well. Their home was always open to those in need, a reflection of the kindness that had brought them together. When Bobby turned 18, he expressed interest in starting his own spread. Ranger helped him purchase land adjacent to the family ranch and taught him everything he knew about running a successful operation. Rose followed her mother's early dreams and became a talented seamstress, eventually opening a shop in town that became known for beautiful, quality work. James took after his father in temperament and stayed on to help run the family ranch. The twins, Lucy and Lily, both married men from neighboring ranches and remained in the area, their families gathering regularly at the Powell homestead for Sunday dinners and holidays. As Grace and Ranger moved into their 40s and then their 50s, they watched with pride as their children built their own lives and families. They became grandparents many times over, their house once again filled with the sounds of children, though this time it was grandchildren climbing on their knees and begging for stories. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Ranger and Grace sat together on the porch where they had shared so many evenings over the years. Their hair was streaked with gray now, and their hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but their love for each other remained as strong as ever. "Do you remember the day we met?" Ranger asked, holding Grace's hand. "Every detail," Grace replied. "I remember being so cold I thought I would never be warm again. And then you opened that barn door, and even though I was terrified, something in your eyes told me I was going to be all right." "I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change," Ranger said. "I just didn't know how much. You gave me everything, Grace. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving day to day." "We gave those things to each other," Grace corrected. "You saved my life, Ranger, in every possible way. You showed me what love and partnership really mean. You gave me the courage to become the person I was meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The ranch that Ranger's father had built and that Ranger had maintained alone for so long was now a true family legacy, something that would be passed down through generations. "No regrets?" Ranger asked. "Not a single one," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "Well, maybe one small regret." Ranger looked at her in surprise. "What's that?" "I regret that I didn't find you sooner," Grace said with a smile. "Think of all the years we could have had together." Ranger laughed and pulled her close. "We've had 30 wonderful years, and God willing, we'll have many more. That's more than most people get in a lifetime." As the years continued to pass, Grace and Ranger remained active in their community and devoted to their family. They celebrated weddings and births, mourned losses, and provided a steady, loving presence for everyone around them. Their marriage was held up as an example of what partnership should look like, built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and unwavering support. When Ranger turned 65, he began to slow down somewhat, letting James and Bobby handle more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. He and Grace spent more time traveling, visiting their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They took a trip to Denver, something Grace had once dreamed of doing as a desperate young woman on the run. This time, she saw it with the eyes of a confident, happy woman with nothing to run from and everything to live for. They also made a trip back to Missouri, though not to visit anyone from Grace's past. Instead, they visited her mother's grave, and Grace was able to finally say a proper goodbye, telling her mother about the wonderful life she had built and thanking her for the values and strength she had instilled in her daughter. As they entered their 70s, both Ranger and Grace remained remarkably healthy. They moved a bit slower and needed more rest, but their minds were sharp and their love for each other unwavering. They spent long evenings sitting together, sometimes talking, sometimes just being in each other's presence, drawing comfort from the decades of shared life. On a warm summer evening, when Grace was 73 and Ranger was 77, they sat together on their porch watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. The family had gathered for a reunion, and the property was full of Powells of various generations, all connected by the love story that had begun in a snowy barn so many years ago. "Can you believe we did all this?" Grace asked, gesturing to the happy chaos around them. "We built something good," Ranger agreed. "Something that will last long after we're gone." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, just as she had done countless times before. "I love you, Ranger Powell. Thank you for finding me in that barn. Thank you for saying I was forgiven. Thank you for giving me a life worth living." "I love you too, Grace Powell," Ranger replied, kissing the top of her head. "And thank you for hiding in my barn. Best thing that ever happened to me was discovering you there." They sat together as the sun set, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built together. From a moment of desperation and kindness had grown something beautiful and lasting, proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected ways. As the evening grew darker and the stars began to appear, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren came to say goodnight. Each one received a hug and a kiss, a reminder of how much they were loved. When everyone had finally settled down for the night, some in the house and others in tents scattered across the property, Ranger and Grace remained on the porch, reluctant to let go of the perfect day. "We should probably head to bed," Grace said eventually, though she made no move to get up. "Just a few more minutes," Ranger said, holding her close. They sat there under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded anything either of them had dared to dream. The journey from that desperate apology in the barn to this moment of complete contentment had been long and sometimes difficult, but every challenge had only strengthened their bond. Years later, when their children would tell the story of how Grace and Ranger met, they would emphasize certain moments: the blizzard, the barn, the apology and forgiveness, the hasty wedding, the confrontation with Henry Foster. But what they understood as they grew older was that the real story wasn't in those dramatic moments. It was in the thousands of ordinary days in between, the quiet acts of love and devotion that built a marriage strong enough to withstand anything. Grace and Ranger lived to see their 80th and 84th birthdays respectively, enjoying several more years of watching their family grow and thrive. When Ranger passed away peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, Grace held his hand and whispered all the things she loved about him, making sure the last words he heard in this life were of love and gratitude. Grace lived for 2 more years after Ranger's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about their grandfather and the life they had shared. When she finally passed, also peacefully in her sleep, The family gathered to mourn and to celebrate a woman who had overcome so much and built such an incredible legacy. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names, the years of their lives, and a simple inscription that Grace had requested. He found her in a storm. She gave him a home. Together, they built a love that would last forever. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management and eventually passed to Bobby's oldest son. The Powell family remained in the Montrose area, each generation adding their own chapter to the family story, while never forgetting the remarkable beginning that had started it all. Every year on the anniversary of Ranger and Grace's wedding, the family would gather at the ranch for a celebration. The children would act out the story of how their ancestors met, with one child playing the frightened Grace hiding in the barn, and another playing the kind Ranger who chose to help rather than turn away. And they would always include the moment when Grace said, "I'm sorry," and Ranger replied, "You're forgiven," because those simple words had changed the course of so many lives. The story of Ranger and Grace Powell became part of local legend, told and retold throughout the years as an example of how compassion and courage could create something beautiful. Young people facing their own challenges would think of Grace's bravery in running away and starting over. Those blessed with abundance would remember Ranger's generosity in helping someone who had nothing. And couples working to build their own marriages would look to Ranger and Grace as proof that true partnership, built on love and respect, could weather any storm. In the end, what had begun with a desperate woman seeking shelter in a barn and a lonely man choosing kindness over suspicion had grown into something that touched hundreds of lives across multiple generations. It was a love story worthy of the Wild West, full of danger and drama, but at its heart, it was about two people who found each other when they needed it most and chose to build something beautiful together. Their legacy lived on not just in their descendants, but in the values they had embodied and passed down. Kindness to strangers, courage in the face of injustice, commitment to family, and the understanding that real love is shown through consistent action rather than grand gestures. The ranch they had built together stood as a physical reminder of what could be accomplished through hard work and partnership, while the family they had raised demonstrated the exponential impact of raising children with love and strong values. Years turned into decades, and decades into generations. But the story of the cowboy who found a woman hiding in his snowy barn, who forgave her trespass and gave her not just shelter but a home, who loved her so completely that together they built an empire of family and love, that story never died. It lived on in the hearts and memories of everyone who heard it, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from choosing compassion over indifference, love over fear, and that forgiveness freely given can open the door to possibilities beyond imagination.